Welcome to True Crime Melting Pot, a podcast about true crime, serial killers, and all things in between. I'm Jess, the host of this podcast. Like and subscribe to my podcast via Podbean or the iTunes app. Also on Facebook, just search True Crime Melting Pot. All links will be in the bio below.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 11 of the podcast. Thank you all again for listening and sticking with me. Those who have stuck around, I greatly appreciate your support. So I'm just going to jump straight into this week's topic because there's a lot to speak about today. So please be advised this podcast contains information of a graphic nature and also information of a graphic nature about a child. Listener discretion is advised. So this week we'll be focusing on the murder of James Bulger, which was committed by Jon Venables and Robert Thompson. On the 12th of February 1993, James disappeared from his mother's side whilst at the Strand, a large shopping centre, much like our Westfields in Bootle, England. Whilst at first James's mother had thought he had just wandered off, as other children at that age would have, little did she know of the horrible events that would come for herself and her family. So a bit of background on the Bulger family. So Denise Bulger and Ralph Bulger were a young couple who lived in the town of Kirkby, Merseyside, England. At 25, Denise had already suffered a miscarriage with her first pregnancy, and having James was her blessing. Denise had said that she did not want any more children, but James was the light of her life at this time. James Patrick Bulger was born on the 16th of March 1990. James was described by his mother as large, big blue eyes, a beaming smile, and sandy brown hair. Denise took James with her everywhere, and James was attached to his mother's hip. The first 3 years of James's life were as normal as a family could be. Fun trips, fun Christmases with all his cousins and his aunts and uncles. Time spent with his grandparents. James's life before this dreaded day in 1993 was, in the eyes of a 3-year-old, perfect. So a bit of background on Jon Venables. Venables was born August 13th, 1982, to parents Susan and Neil Venables. Neil worked as a forklift driver but was often unemployed, and John was the middle child, and both his siblings had developmental problems. His older brother was born with a cleft palate, which led to communication problems and increasing frustration and temper tantrums. Venables' brother attended a special school, and his parents spent a lot of their time trying to control him. Sometimes he would be even sent to foster families, so they would having to spend so much time with the younger brother that they would literally put Venables into a foster home. Venables' younger sister also had developmental problems and ended up at a special needs school as well. Venables was stuck in the middle, feeling ignored and perhaps resentful for the attention his siblings received. Sometimes John would mimic his older brother's tantrums. The household was in a state of constant upheaval. Venables' father left, and the mother and children lived with her mother, and then moved in with the father again, only to move out to find public housing in Liverpool. Sometimes the father would return for reconciliation. The instability affected all 3 kids, so he was in and out of his life, all of his childhood. At the age of 7, Venables was showing signs of antisocial behaviour. He hated the neighbourhood children who would tease him and his siblings. Venables himself had a squint in his eye, which other kids mocked. Venables was an easy target for other kids, and they teased him mercilessly because he was so easily worked up by their provocations. Venables, being too difficult to manage, was transferred to a different school, and this is where he met the other boy in this true crime story, Robert Thompson. I'll go into his life a bit after Venables. Once these 2 boys had come together, they became the bullies and started picking on other children, singling out easy targets and the weaker children. With Thompson by Venables' side, he felt bigger and stronger. Some would later argue that Venables' behaviour developed from being at home with his father, not through abuse, but through rented movies. Neil Venables rented a lot of videos which had been made, which had been a bit of a concern. I don't see the theory in this, but anyway, even the judge at the Bulger trial made mention of the influence of the horror movies. The father did not rent particularly brutal movies, but John loved karate movies and wished he could be like Rocky. He drew scenes from the Halloween films, but it was Venables' father's rental of Child's Play in 1993 that called attention to his violence and video connection. So in Child's Play 3, the soul of the serial killer inhabits a doll named Chucky, and the evil doll was about the size of James, runs around slaughtering hapless victims. There is also a scene that comes into play a bit later on the way, in which James was brutalised. So a bit of background on the other killer, Robert Thompson. Thompson was brought up in a heavily violent home, and he was the product of his environment. Thompson's personality was constructed not so much out of aggression as for the purpose of defence. He lived in a rough environment. His father would beat his mother mercilessly, and then he would abandon the family for good. Robert Thompson's father's upbringing was also paralleled his son's. Left without adult supervision, the older brothers bullied the younger brothers into submission, so it was just the circle continuing. His mother also came from an abusive family, and at the age of 18, she married Thompson's father to escape the beatings from her father, but only to come into a new round of beatings from her husband. She was an aggressive alcoholic, and he beat the mother in front of Thompson, and out of frustration and fear, the sons were also beaten. At the age of 4, the eldest Thompson boy was placed in Child Protective Services after he'd been abused, and it was downhill from there. Another sibling became a master thief, taking Thompson with him on his adventures. One brother was an arsonist and suspected of sexually abusing young children, and Robert that may have been a victim himself. Another brother threatened the teachers with violence. When the eldest had to babysit the youngest, they would lock them in the pigeon shed. One of the brothers left to stay in a voluntary care centre, and the other had attempted suicide. So as you can see, both of the homes were very, very, very rough and brutal. Robert was the 5th out of 6 brothers, and he did his best to be a good son. Thompson would help his mother in the kitchen, trying to please her and provide her some support. He babysat his mother's 7th child, who had a different father. Thompson was not aggressive as much as sly. He was a poor student. He skipped school, but when he did attend, he was not considered a troublemaker. Teachers thought he was shy and quiet, yet manipulative of others. Thompson, both hindered by his reputation because of the name, but he also seemed to hide behind it. Unfortunately, Robert's abuse at the hand of his older brothers began to repeat in his treatment of his younger brother Ryan. He intimidated his younger brother, but they shared a strange bond. At night they would lie in bed together, sucking one another's thumb. During the course of the trial, Ryan began exhibiting these increasing behaviours, and he wet his bed regularly, set fires in his room, gained weight. He seemed jealous of the attention Robert received, and his mother was fearful that he would do something equally horrible to get the same treatment. Extraordinarily, violence was proving to be an effective ticket out of the hellish Thompson household. So for all of Thompson's toughness, he still exhibited childish tendencies, for which he was teased. He played with troll dolls and sucked his thumb. John put him down for playing with girls and being girlish himself. Moulded into hardness beyond his years and forced to repress his own childness, it's possible that Thompson took out his aggression on an innocent baby, and something that Robert himself was never allowed to be. So he was seeing James as, why do you get to be a child? And I didn't get that. So going now into the actual kidnapping and murder of James. So the kidnap. So CCTV evidence from the New Strand shopping centre in Bootle, taken on the 12th of February 1993, showed Thompson and Venables casually observing children, apparently selecting a target. The boys were playing truant from school, which they did regularly, throughout the day. Thompson and Venables were seen stealing items, including sweets, a troll doll, some batteries, a can of blue paint, some of which were found at the murder scene. That same afternoon, James Bulger from nearby Kirkby went with his mother Denise to the New Strand shopping centre. Whilst inside a butcher's shop at around 3:40 p.m, Denise realised that her son had disappeared. He had been left at the door of the shop while she placed an order. He was spotted by Thompson and Venables. They approached him and spoke to him before taking him by the hand and leading him out of the precinct. This moment was captured on CCTV camera, recording time stamped at 15:42 or 3:42 p.m. This footage is the most famous from this case. The imagery projected across televisions at the time of these young boys walking away, hand in hand with James, whilst leading him to the unknown in his little mine. You can actually see this footage anywhere you search. It's very haunting. You can see the poor little boy being taken away by these two young men. The butcher mixed up the order, occupying Denise a little longer than she expected. Nicola, her companion, had just seen James playing with his cigarette butt by the door. When the young mother left the shop to scoop up her child, he was gone. She ran back inside flustered. "I was only in the shop a few seconds. I turned around and he'd gone," she cried. After the reading the book that James's mother had wrote about the incident, she obviously had the heartbreaking what ifs. So James's mother Denise made the comment that on the day of the murder, when she realised that James had disappeared, upon coming out of the butcher shop, she had looked left and right. So left was into the actual shopping centre, and then to the right was the doors that led outside. So Denise made the decision to go left instead of right, so not thinking James had been abducted, but mischievously run off into the shops. You can read Denise's despair, in which if she had only gone right, she might have been able to see James being led off by these two young murderers. But she went back into the shops to see if he'd just run into another shop, not thinking that he was taken. So the boys took Bulger on a 2.5 mile hike, which is 4 k's, a walk across Liverpool, leading him to the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, where he was dropped on his head and suffered injuries to his face. The boys joked about pushing Bulger into the canal. During the walk across Liverpool, the boys were seen by 38 people. Bulger had a bump on his forehead and was crying, but most bystanders did nothing to intervene, assuming that he was a younger brother. 2 people challenged the older boys, but they claimed that Bulger was a young brother, or that he was lost and they were taking him to the local police station. At one point, the boys took Bulger into a pet shop, from which they were ejected. Eventually, the boys led Bulger to the railway line near the disused Walton and Anfield railway station, close to the Walton Lane police station and Anfield Cemetery, where they attacked him. The murder. The attack and the murder of James Bulger occurred between 5:45 and 6:30 p.m. At the trial, it was established that at this location, one of the boys threw blue Humbrol modelling paint into Bulger's left eye. They kicked him and hit him with bricks, stones, and a 22-pound or 10-kilo iron bar, described in the court as a railway fish plate. They placed batteries in his mouth. James Bulger suffered 10 skull fractures as a result of the iron bar striking his head. Alan Williams, the case's pathologist, Bulger suffered so many injuries, 42 in total, that none could be isolated as the fatal blow. His clothing, which had been removed from the waist down, was laid near his head. His underwear was heavily soaked with blood. Nearby police found a heavy iron bar 2 feet long with bloodstains, and many bricks and stones with blood. They also found 3 AA batteries near the body. These batteries intrigued the investigators, who had suspicions about their placement before James was hit by the train. A tin of blue paint was also found nearby. James had been severely beaten around the head and neck. There had been fractures, cuts, bruises caused by blows from a heavy blunt object, and there had been severe bleeding. On one cheek a patterned bruise appeared, which indicated the imprint from a shoe. Although there was no conclusive evidence indicating a sexual assault, forensic specialists believe that some of the injuries from below the waist were suspicious and sexual in nature. Before they left him, the boys led Bulger across the railway tracks and weighted his head down with rubble, in a hope that a train would hit him and make his death appear to be an accident. After Bulger's killers left the scene, his body was cut in half by a train. Bulger's severed body was discovered 2 days later, on 14th of February. A forensic pathologist testified that he had died before he was struck by the train. His upper body was hidden within the coat, and his lower body was further down the tracks, completely undressed. After the murder and arrest, so this was after everything had occurred. So after the assault, John and Robert walked back to town, where they went to visit a friend who wasn't home, but hung out the front of his house anyway. Bored, they ambled over to the video store, one of Robert's favourite places. Sometimes he ran errands for one of the women behind the counter, including picking up overdue rentals. She offered them a reward if they could collect on a particular past due rental. Back at the video store, the boys were about to receive their reward when Susan Venables, John's mother, swung through the door, furious. She'd been searching for John everywhere, including the railroad tracks. Susan pulled both John and Robert out of the video store, screaming and beating them both. Robert ran away. She hauled John to the police station and asked the officer on duty to lecture John. At home, John was in tears. Susan told him that a little boy had been kidnapped from the shopping centre, and whoever the maniac was, he could have taken Jon. Little did she know. In the meantime, Robert had run home in tears and told his mother how Jon Venables' mum dragged me out of the video shop. Robert's mother, Ann Thompson, was furious and immediately reported the beating to the police. As David James Smith, author of Beyond All Reason, said, both boys were immediately back in their more familiar role as victims rather than victimizers. At the station, the officer noticed a small scratch under Robert's left eye. They assumed it was from Susan Venables. James's disappearance made the evening news and immediately calls poured in. Many believed they had seen the toddler in Walton. After one report that James was spotted by the canal, investigators planned to drag the water in the morning. The police interviewed Ralph and Denise Bulger, retracing their steps at the Boodle Strand. James's video image eventually scattered across the television screens. There he was, as they watched in belief. The blurry, jumpy images almost go like with two boys, not the ponytail man that had previously been accused. As they watched in disbelief, they realized they were not dealing with an older pedophile, but two young boys. Children themselves. There was no way to identify the two older boys, but the baby's clothing matches Denise's description. They played the tape over and over, watching in horror as James was led towards the exit. Why would two children take another child? Police could understand the motives of a pedophile, but this was incomprehensible. Once this image was released, the uproar that followed was immense. On Sunday morning, a train engineer noticed something on the tracks that looked like a doll. At first it didn't strike him as unusual. Neighbourhood kids routinely laid things out on the tracks. But after he thought about the missing child, he called the police that evening. 4 boys found James's body on the tracks on Sunday afternoon, when they went up to the railroad to look for footballs. At first they thought he was a cat, then a doll torn in two. Jon showed an increased interest in the story of James's disappearance. He asked his mother if they caught the boys. "If I seen them lads, I'd kick their heads in," he had said. On Sunday, when his mother told Jon that the little boy had been found dead by the railroad, Jon expressed concern for his poor mum. Neil, Jon's father, asked him about the blue paint on his coat sleeve, and Jon said Robert threw it at him. When the news reported that blue paint had been found on the boy's body, the Venables did not openly suspect their son, even though he had missed school by the day James was murdered and wore a mustard-coloured jacket, the same as the boy in the video. The uproar in the community and the hatred towards the boys that had killed this innocent little boy was so intense that the following occurred, which in my opinion would have been so traumatizing at the time. Police would check Friday's absentee list from the schools and held press conferences, partially in hope of finding more witnesses, but also to keep the public calm. It was as if a witch hunt had developed overnight in Merseyside, but this time the suspects were boys. Reports came in and casting blame on one bad child or another. Even parents called the station to report their own children as suspects, which is insane. When police arrested one suspicious 12-year-old boy, residents were so furious that they attacked his house and broke windows after a mob of police led the boy away. His family had to be moved, and the boy hadn't even been officially charged with the crime. So the arrest. An anonymous woman called the police station reporting that her friend Susan Venables had a son named Jon, who had skipped school Friday and had blue paint on his jacket sleeves. He resembled the boy in the video. She said he had a friend named Robert Thompson with whom he skipped school that day. With no other solid leads, investigators decided that Jon and Robert should be brought in for questioning. 7:30 in the morning on a Thursday, February 18th, 4 police officers appeared on Ann Thompson's doorstep with the search warrant. When Robert realized that he was a suspect, he began to cry. They rounded up his clothes and immediately noticed that there was blood on his shoes. When they came for Jon Venables, his mother, Susan, answered the door and said snidely, "I knew you'd be here. I told him you'd want to see him for sagging school on Friday." Susan mentioned that Jon came home on Friday coat full of paint. Officers promptly asked for Jon's mustard yellow coat, which had been indeed splattered with blue paint. It appeared that there was a small handprint on the sleeve. Jon grabbed hold of his mother and sobbed, "I don't want to go to prison, Mum. I didn't kill the baby." He cried hysterically. "It's that Robert Thompson. He always gets me into trouble." Through tears, Jon told police that they should speak to Robert. As they drove into the police station, Jon continued to ask Robert ask about Robert, had they arrested him yet, where they were taking him. Despite Robert and John's distressed reactions to being arrested, the police did not immediately suspect they were the killers. They were simply following up on a tip. The boys, especially Jon, were both terrified and fascinated by the police procedure. As they took Jon's fingerprints, he nervously asked how fingerprints work. They seemed like invisible ink, magical to him. Do you leave these on whatever you touch? He asked. If you touch someone's skin, does it leave a fingerprint? If you drag someone really hard, do you leave your nails in his skin? He wanted to know if they were taking Robert Thompson's prints too. Police took blood, hair, and fingernail samples from both boys. In the meantime, a shopkeeper from the Strand called the police. The boys from the video might have been in their store on the day James disappeared, so police came down and took fingerprints. Jon's were a match. So the interviews. So once both boys were brought in for questioning, this is where the story began to unfold. Both boys began blaming each other, stating that one did this and one did that. I will go through each interviews with both Thompson and Venables. So Thompson was interviewed on the Thursday, the same day as he was brought in, by Detective Sergeant Phil Roberts and Detective Constable Bob Jacobs. The interviews were recorded with his mother Anne sitting by, along with legal representation. Questioning a 10-year-old boy for murder would be difficult. It was hard to know if Robert would grasp his legal rights. They asked him if he knew the difference between truth and lies. Robert said he understood, but during the course of the interview, he slipped between the two with ease. Robert was used to skirmishing around with the truth, but usually over petty things like whether he went to school that day or where his homework was. He replied to difficult questions with a bratty, "Well, I was there and you weren't," or "That was what you think." But Robert's lying skill would soon snap like cheap clips under the weight of the charges. Robert admitted that he and Jon skipped school on the Friday and went to the Strand shopping centre, where they walked around looking at the shops, trying to sound like a witness, not a suspect. Robert claimed that he saw James with his mother while he and Jon were on the escalator. This struck the investigators as odd. Why would Robert take notice of this little boy with his mother? The shopping centre was filled with mothers and children, but he insisted that he saw James with Mrs. Bulger. Robert then claimed he and Jon left the Strand, went to the library, and then home. As you can see, the story kept changing every time that Thompson was asked about what they were doing at this time. He kept trying to cover his tracks, and although he was giving these bratty answers, he was cracking under the pressure of the police and their tactics to get the right answers. Robert sometimes cried when he was caught in a lie, but detectives were suspicious of his sorrow. No tears, and the crying suddenly stopped when the pressure was off. He began to sob, "I never touched him." Thompson thought by crying he would make the police officer ease up on him. Little did he know that they could see right through this, and this was a major factor towards his age. During a break, both investigative teams conferred. Venables had said that he was with Thompson, but would not admit to going to the Strand. Upon commencing the interviews, the detective asked Thompson why he thought Venables would lie about being at the Strand. Thompson thought that perhaps Venables did do something bad. He might have made the baby follow them and then lost him somewhere, but Thompson did not know because he didn't look behind his shoulder. When investigators said that he had the same jacket as one of the boys in the interview, Thompson replied, "Many jackets get sold the same as mine, but what about Jon's more distinctive jacket?" "Yeah, well, he's not walking along with me." Throughout the interview, Thompson's responses were unflustered. He had been a tough guy all of his life and knew how to keep his cool. He admitted nothing. Later in the evening, when the more detailed admissions began, the following is a conversation between Thompson and the interrogating officer, Roberts. So, Detective Roberts, "We believe that you left with baby James and with Jon." Thompson, "Who says?" Detective Roberts, "We say now." "No, I left with him." "Well, tell me what happened then." "It shows in the paper that Jon had hold of his hand." He had slightly implicated Venables without admitting to have seen him do it, but he had also claimed to be with Venables all day. It was only moments before he would be cornered into admitting more. Thompson had now admitted that Venables had James by the hand and that they walked around, but let him go by the church. Upset, Thomas lamented that he was going to get all the blame for murdering him. Finally, late in the evening, Robert was told that he was being detained and could not go home. "Why do I have to stay here?" he asked. "Jon was the one that took the baby." The next morning, Thompson said that he left Venables and James by the railway after Venables threw paint at James's eye and had no idea what happened after that. But when the investigators asked if he stole batteries, Thompson's face grew crimson. "Yeah, well, I'm hot." He denied it. He was obviously deeply embarrassed by the mention of the batteries. The next day, there were many more hours of denials from Thompson skirting around the story. It was Thompson's mother that eventually got a major breakthrough from him. Thompson's mother Anne tells her son that it will be easier if he just tells the truth. Thompson had been sobbing. The following is a conversation between Thompson's mother and the interrogating officer. Thompson: "John threw a brick in his face." Thompson's mother: "Why?" Thompson: "I don't know." Detective Roberts: "Right, try to think. Right, let's see what we've got. We're getting there, aren't we? We're getting there to the truth now." Thompson: "Yeah, well, I'm going to end up all the blame, because I've got blood on me." Thompson goes on to describe Venables in an out-of-control killing frenzy. He claimed John threw more bricks at the baby and then hit him with a big metal thing with holes in it. Then Venables hit James with a stick. James was lying there still, eyes open, crossed the tracks. Venable had the batteries and threw one of them at James's face. All the time Thompson said he was trying to pull Venables away, screaming at him to stop. Astounded, the detectives asked, "Why did John do all of this?" Robert didn't know. "I only pinched," he said. When investigators tell Robert they think he hit James too, he replied, "Well, that's what you think." Crying for the fact that he had got caught and that his mother was having to sit there in this interview in disbelief as to what was unfolding in front of her eyes and what she was hearing about her son. Many of Thompson's responses were directed at his mother. "I tried to get him off, he just kept hitting him and hitting him and hitting him and I couldn't do nothing about it." When she asked why he brought a rose to James's memorial, he said, "Because then baby James knows I tried to help him up there and I'm thinking of him now." Thompson also expressed some fear about being haunted by the murdered baby. The last comment just goes to show the small amount of innocence that remained, that these boys were still so young and that one of their fears was that a ghost of the child that they murdered in cold blood was one of their genuine worries. This just goes to show the age of the boys. Detectives saved the most difficult question for last. James had some trauma to his genitals, and the police believe that one or both of the boys had inserted AA batteries into his rectum. These questions upset Thomas more than any other accusations. When they asked who removed James's pants and underwear, he began to cry. "I'm not a pervert, you know," he said, suddenly agitated. "Well, how would you like me calling you a pervert?" Normally collected, Thompson had lost it. He said, "I'm a pervert. They said I've played with his willy," he told his mum, and refused to answer any more questions. But the detectives persisted. "What would John say you did to James?" they asked. Thompson was greatly upset by now. He said the Venables would say he took off James's pants and played with his privates. Towards the end of the interviews, Thompson said that Venables tried to cover up James's head with stones, but he admitted to putting one brick on to stop all of the bleeding. So Venables' interview. Venables was hysterical from the start. He was extremely scared and intimidated by the investigators. They had to halt the questions when Venables became so distressed that he couldn't speak, which was often. He didn't lie as much as he avoided the truth. After he calmed down and was encouraged to be honest, Venables would admit to some things, unlike Thompson, who denied everything. His mother Susan was there, and her presence upset Venables. It was only after the detective pulled her and John's father aside and asked them to reassure Venables that they would love him no matter what had happened, that Venables was able to admit his participation. Venables and Thompson showed that they actually were more scared of their parents than what was actually going to be the prospect of going to jail. When I get to the trial as well, you will see how much these boys did not get the gravity of the matter and how severe these crimes were. On the first morning of the interviews, Venables wanted to put down Thompson. Thompson was the bad one, the troublemaker, and he avoided Thompson at school. Thompson mostly played with girls because everyone else had thought he was bad. He's much of a girl, he said. Venables talked about how Thompson collected troll dolls, the naked ones. "It shows you their bum and that," Venables said. Thompson sucked his thumb. Yet Venables sounded enamoured with Thompson and his willingness to do bad things. He talked about how Thompson sags and how they go stealing together, and said it was exciting being with Thompson. He did things with Thompson that he didn't do with other good friends. He wouldn't do bad things on his own. "I'm too scared." On Friday, the day of the crime, Venables said that it was Thompson's idea to miss school. Venables spun a long yarn about the details of the day. They went to the park, the old railways, to a cemetery, where Thompson wanted to steal the flowers, but Venables said no. Venables said that Thompson stole paint and threw it at Venables. as elaborated as Venables' story was, he made no mentions of brutal Strand. When he later heard about Thompson admitted they had gone to the Strand, Venables cried that Thompson was lying. The following is a famous excerpt from the interviews. You can search these on YouTube. At this point in the interview, Venables was uncontrollably upset. Detective Dale: you see, Robert says that he was with you and that you were indeed in brutal New Strand together. Jon Venables: we wasn't. Detective Dale: Robert says you were. Jon Venables: yeah, we was, but we never saw any kids there. We never robbed any kids. Detective Dale: so you were in the brutal New Strand? Susan Venables shouting in anger: was you in brutal Strand? Jon Venables in tears: yeah, but we never got a kid, Mum, we never got a kid. Detective Dale: Mrs. Venables, I must ask you not to get angry with him. Jon Venables in hysterics: but we never got a kid, Mum, we never. We saw those two lads together, we did. We never got a kid, Mum. Mum, we never got a kid. You think we did. We never. Mum, we never. The next morning, investigators confronted Venables with more of Thompson's version of events. Thompson claimed that Venables took the baby. Venables jumped out of his seat. I haven't touched a boy, he screamed over and over. I never killed him, Mum. Mum, we took him and left him at the canal, Mum, that's all. He cried to Susan. They asked how they'd get the baby at Strand. He was just walking around on his own, he claimed. Venables saw that he was contradicting himself, telling obvious lies. The more cornered and the closer that he got to the truth, he was, the more distressed he grew. After both Susan and Neil reassured Venables they'd love him no matter what and urged him to tell the truth, Venables climbed into his mother's lap and sobbed. I did kill him, said Venables. What about his mum? Will you tell her I'm sorry? This was what the investigators needed. Venables had admitted it, plain and simple, but they were curious about the I in the confession. They were sure Robert participated. The question was, to what extent? Venables was the one that spilt most of the information. He completely broke in these interviews, remembering at this point the ages of both Venables and Thompson. The interviews continued later on in the day, and Venables said that Thompson stole paint at a toy store in the Strand. They saw a child, and Thompson said, let's get this kid lost. The two boys brought him through the T.J. Hughes department store until his mother found them. They saw James in front of the butcher shop. Venables confessed that he walked toward the baby and took him by the hand, but it was Thompson's idea to kill him. As they walked around, Venables said they thought about looking for his mother, but Thompson suggested that they throw him in the water at the canal. Thompson tried to get the toddler to lean toward the water, hoping he would lose his balance and fall, but James wouldn't go to the water's edge. Venables said that Thompson picked up James and threw him down. Scared, they ran away, but came back. Venables couldn't say why. They just wanted to walk around with the baby. Venables admitted that he took the hood off James's anorak and threw it up into the tree as they walked towards the railway, but this was as far as he would go for now. The closer they got to the murder, the more upset Venables became. He did not want to talk about what he called the worst bit. When Venables was willing to talk, he blamed the violence on Thompson. We took him to the railway and started throwing bricks at him. When asked who threw the bricks, Venables said Thompson, who also threw the metal pole. Venables admitted to throwing 2 bricks, only teeny little stones, and only on the arms, not his head. According to Venables, Thompson threw blue paint in James's face. James began to cry, and Thompson asked, is your head hurting? We'll get a plaster on. And he lifted a brick and threw it at James's head. James screamed and fell back, but got up again. Venables said at one point he tried to pull Thompson back. James just kept getting back up, and Thompson was saying, stay down. Thompson was shouting and calling James bad names. After Thompson hit him with an iron bar, James fell onto his stomach on the tracks, and both boys ran. Venables claimed he then said to Thompson, don't you think we've done enough now? Venables said that he was never mad at James. No, I didn't really want to hurt him. I didn't want to hurt him or nothing, because I didn't want to hurt him with strong things, only like light things. I deliberately minced. He also said that it was Thompson who pulled off James's pants and underwear. Venables did help by pulling off his shoes off, but he couldn't say why. He said Thompson picked up the underwear covered James's face. Although Venables claimed to feel no anger towards the baby, he showed physical signs of agitation during the interview when talking about his murder, including clenching his fists. When the subject of batteries came up, Venables became hysterical once again and started to cry. I didn't know anything about what Thompson did with the batteries. Venables was afraid that you'll blame it on me that I had them. Asked if Thompson did anything else to James's genitals. Venables grew very upset, began to punch his father, who sat beside him. It was obvious, I believe, from that behaviour displayed when asked about the genital mutilation and the batches inside of James, that Venables was disgusted at himself or at Thompson for what he did. His reactions were out of anger. Some say that he's reacting like this due to the fact that he was angry that he had gotten caught. So the charge. The Walton police decided to take the boys on a drive to verify the route that they walked with James. Venables went in first in an unmarked car. He asked the police, "Can fingerprints come out on skin?" When they took Thompson out, he was worried about encountering Venables. Indeed, both boys were anxious about seeing each other after the crime. Were they mad at each other or afraid that the other would be angry about the lies that the other had told? On Saturday at 6:15 p.m, Venables and Thompson were charged with the abduction and murder of James. Authorities also charged both boys with an attempted abduction of the other child at TJ Hughes. Venables sat and drew on some paper while waiting for the charge to be read, crying only when his mother cried. When Thompson was charged that same night, he simply responded, "It was Venables that done that." Thompson was scarily calm about the whole thing, and it did not seem to faze him that he killed a child. So the court case and outcome. In the aftermath of their arrest and throughout the media accounts of their trial, the boys were referred to as Child A, Thompson, and Child B, Venables. 500 protesters gathered at the South Sefton Magistrates Court during the boys' initial court appearances. The parents of the accused were moved to different parts of the country and assumed new identities following the death threats from vigilantes. The full trial opened at Preston Crown Court on the 1st of November 1993, conducted as an adult trial with the accused in the dock away from their parents, and the judge and court officials in their legal regalia. The boys denied the charges of murder, abduction, and attempted abduction brought against them. The attempted abduction charge related to an incident at the Strand shopping centre earlier on 12th of February 1993, the day of Bulger's death. Each boy sat in view of the court on raised chairs so that they could see out of the dock designed for results, accompanied by 2 social workers. Although they were separated from their parents, they were within touching distance with their families attended the trial. News stories reported the demeanour of the defendants. These aspects were later criticised by the European Court of Human Rights, which ruled in 1999 that they had not received a fair trial by being tried in public in an adult court. On the raised platform sat Thompson, heavier than before and looking older than his now 11 years. He stared ahead or up at the ceiling, kicked his shoes off, and yawned. He showed little emotion. Onlookers assumed Robert was the guilty one. He had no family present and sat glumly next to his social worker, who showed little affection toward him. Venables, on the other hand, won some sympathy with court observers. He seemed more contrite, anxious, constantly looking back at his mother for her support. At the trial, the lead prosecution counsel, Richard Henricks, QC, successfully refuted the principle of doli incapax, which presumes that young children cannot be held legally responsible for their actions. The child psychiatrist, Dr. Eileen Vizard, who interviewed Thompson before the trial, was asked in court whether he would know the difference between right and wrong, that it was wrong to take the young child away from his mother, and that it was wrong to cause injury to the child. Vizard replied, "If the issue is on the balance of probabilities, I think I can answer with certainty." Vizard also said that Thompson was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder after the attack on Bulger. Dr. Susan Bailey, the Home Office forensic psychiatrist who interviewed Venables, said unequivocally that he knew the difference between right and wrong. She believed that there was no organic disability or brain damage which caused Venables' behaviour problem. She concluded that he was fit to stand trial. Psychological reports assured that Jon did not suffer from any severe mental illness, including depression or hallucinations. He was anxious, fidgety, and temperamentally fragile. Jon could be easily distressed and was unable to discuss the murder. The defence countered neither of these boys had done anything violent before, only shoplifting and truancy. This was a mischievous prank gone out of control. If they had planned to kill a child, they could have drowned him at the canal or thrown him in traffic, but they didn't. If the plan was to kill him at a railroad, why walk along one of the busiest stretches in Liverpool and converse with potential witnesses? They told adults they found the child. If they were set on killing him, why allow the adults the opportunity to intervene? Thompson's lawyer Turner argued that Venables and Thompson were tired, unaware how to end their own prank, and did not know what to do with James. They were afraid of abandoning him or handing him over to a grown-up. Turner argued that it was Venables who was in control and reminded the jury that Venables admitted, "I did kill him." Brian Walsh, Venables' defendant, said, "The two defendants are in fact very different boys." Walsh tried to summon sympathy from Venables by casting Thompson as the bad one, which was easy for most to believe. Walsh claimed Venables admitted to some involvement, but he didn't want to kill James. Thompson's defense attorney David Turner immediately suggested that a fair trial was impossible. Inflammatory papers called the boys evil, demonic monsters, fiends. He also requested that 2 evidence photos of James's head injuries be removed because of their potential emotional effect on the jury. But the judges denied both requests. John's attorney Brian Walsh was more reserved in his requests. Thompson and Venables did not speak during the trial, and the case against them was based to a large extent on the more than 20 hours of tape-recorded police interviews with the boys, which were played back in court. Evidence was key as both of the boys did not participate in the trial. They watched as the evidence clearly indicated their guilt. The Strand security videos, blood-spattered bricks, stones, clothing, a tin of blue paint, and a heavy bar. Forensic scientists gave assessments of James' injuries, which were so numerous that they couldn't determine which one caused his death. One particular imprint on James's cheek conclusively linked Thompson's bloody shoe, indicating that he was the indisputable participant. The verdict. The 2 boys, by then aged 11, were found guilty of Bulger's murder at Preston Crown Court on 24th of November 1993, becoming the youngest convicted killers of the 20th century. The judge, Mr. Justice Moreland, told Thompson and Venables that they had committed a crime of unparalleled evil and barbarity. In my judgment, your conduct was both cunning and very wicked. Venables sobbed while Thompson sat motionless. The judge sentenced them to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, with a recommendation that they should be kept in custody for very, very many years to come. Recommending a minimum term of 8 years, shortly after the trial, Lord Taylor of Gosford, the Lord Chief Justice, ordered that the 2 boys should serve a minimum of 10 years, which would have made them eligible for release in February 2003 at the age of 20. Current day. The child murderers are now 34, and 1 is still in jail. They were granted release at the age of 18 under close supervision with new identities and granted lifelong anonymity. They had completed high school studies, and Venables' minders, at least, considered that he posed only a trivial risk to the community. Today, however, Venables is serving a 40-month sentence, starting in February 2018, for making indecent images of children on his computer and having sickening pedophile manual in his possession. It is not the first time he was recalled to prison, in 2010 for possession of child pornography. He has said that he has urges in this direction and cannot resist. An application early this year by James's father and uncle to have Venables' anonymity order at least partially overturned was refused by the head of the UK Family Court on the ground that it would be a death sentence for him. The government now appears to want him out of the country, ostensibly because of the cost of defending such suits, but perhaps also because of the potential cost of shielding a man who is known to be addicted to child pornography and apparently trading it in. Thompson's new identity is protected by an unprecedented injunction which applies around the world, meaning that even searching for his address could lead to a prison sentence. He has not reoffended since being released, and in 2010 it was reported that he was in a long-term relationship with a man who knows his true identity. So thank you guys for tuning in. That was the end of the podcast. I really enjoyed writing and researching this topic. This one is something that I've known quite a lot about. I've read all the books and things like that. Sorry that they've been so sporadic lately as well. I just want to give good content and nothing rushed, and I feel the last podcast was a bit rushed, so this way we'll be moving on to bigger and better things. So I'll see you guys in the next podcast. Thanks for listening.